People through their individual lives did something for the sake of peace through knowing their own ability to be creative in many different ways, as that quote says, even making a good soup, in doing some small gesture that's a creative way of reaching out to people, to identify with people. That's so important. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, Corita Kent, the former Sister Corita, and two artists that I respect greatly, Fritz Eichenberg, who did the illustrations for The Catholic Worker, was a friend of Dorothy Day, and Käthe Kollwitz, a woman artist in Germany who lost both son and grandson in World War I, World War II. So her images are filled with compassion and a desire for peace throughout her whole life, her illustrations. So they're the people that I came up with as real artisans of peace, from present to past. I think we tend to lock up our meaning of creativity. When we work with children, we see that we're born artists. They're very spontaneous. And during this pandemic, you see artists in children working from Zooming or whatever. The arts are a way they can express themselves. The children in concentration camps used to draw on the walls, on anything they could find to express what they were experiencing. Going back in time, those who lived in caves expressed their lives through the arts. It's always been with us. And children are the greatest expressions of the fact that we're all born artists. It's once we get into the stage of lives that we get caught up in perfectionism and other people's ideas of how we should look at things. Children just see everything differently. Lots of books have been written about that. And I think in education, we really should be encouraging spontaneity and encouraging children to say what's inside of them, because it's going to last through a lifetime. That creative spirit have been the food of a lot of geniuses. I think Leonardo da Vinci and Steve Jobs were both creative by keeping journals, by drawing ideas, by visualization. So I think parents have a lot to do with this, the way they encourage children to be spontaneous and be free expressing themselves. I talk about Leonard Bernstein, who through his music actually conveyed creativity, prophetic images, and even in West Side Story, that sense of justice and seeing other people as the same as ourselves. to love somebody who's a different color, background. He gets into lots of different social justice issues through the arts. Corita Kent, even though she couldn't go to protest, she definitely, through her billboards, using commercials, even, which got her into trouble, comparing the Blessed Mother to a juicy tomato. And because she did that, she was thinking of the ripeness, the beauty. Well, the cardinal in LA did not appreciate that. So she was silenced, and her community was silenced because she had the courage to be creative, to speak what was inside her. People didn't think what she did was artistic, but her mind was so creative, she couldn't actually shut down at night. She kept thinking visually. So it's not necessarily, creativity is expressed in so many different ways, and creative people are sometimes held suspect by those who are regimented in life, who can look at things differently. I think the real creative people are aware of everything. They look at the beauty of flowers and they see something beyond that. They see the person who grew these with care, who believed in the soil, in how important climate change is. Everything is connected for the person who's creative. And I talked about Ida earlier. Her creativity saved her. It allowed her to speak to people. I took her to an exhibit once at the museum. It was retrospective of Picasso's work. And I turned to her at the end of the exhibit and said, Ida, what do you think of Picasso's work? And she winked at me and she said, child, I can do better than that. And I thought, isn't that great that she had the confidence in her own work? That made me so happy. I didn't consider her her teacher. She was definitely self-taught. So my way of teaching was to be hands-off with somebody like Ida. She knew what she was doing. Even with her little magic markers, she was excellent in expressing her creativity. So it's in the realm of each one of us. We have to believe that. But sometimes it takes somebody outside of ourselves to recognize that. A mentor, an older person, a parent, a friend, to take the time to say, boy, you're creative. You could be doing lots of great things. You think differently. It takes somebody like that outside of us to encourage. I think some of my best work comes from tension. And certainly for a person like Ida, her suffering of 15 years produced that buildup of creativity. And my hunch was that liberation theology is alive in these poor neighborhoods. They taught me what it meant. And I think a lot of people, I guess the one lesson is that a lot of people don't ever rub shoulders with people who are another color, another culture. And once you do, you learn so much from each other. That was the purpose of Southwest Center. The people taught me. So I'll give you an example. One day, I used to have the radio on all the time, and I put on the jazz station thinking that the people would enjoy their music. And one of the women, Ruth Barkley, said to me, Sister Helen, I have to say this. Just because we're black doesn't mean we like jazz. Would you please change the station? Which I did. And that was a lesson. I was stereotyping, and they were always so honest. That's what I loved about them. And they knew we were friends, and they knew they could say that to me. And I would receive it every day. There was something else to learn. And you begin to look at people as friends, no longer strangers. That's what happened at the center for 14 years. I still miss the people. I considered it a Camelot time in my life. I was actually living liberation theology. And I think that's what some people are missing. And we build up fear of the other that we don't understand or don't take time to talk to. And I wish people could have more of those experiences with other cultures. And I think we have a real chance right now with the migrants, with the black community, with the Native American community, and really be sensitive to their suffering. And they, in turn, be sensitive to ours. In that book that Henry Nouwen wrote, Walk with Jesus, that's the idea. When I first did that book, Henry said to me, we can't be the white person looking at the poor. We have to see each other's vulnerabilities, our sufferings, and have a mutual exchange. So we're always learning, always being open to the other, and we're the other to those cultures.